Why do the friends of Senator Kennedy, who was the clown prince of the Kennedy machine, why do they cause a bunch of insane lunatics, the Khomeini dictatorship, to invade the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, seize Americans hostage? Why do they do it? It's very simple. Last spring, another member of the Carter administration, Defense Secretary Harold Brown, together with echoes from Zbigniew Brzezinski, who does make political statements, but he's not attacking waitresses. And he gets euphoric, you know, he jumps up on the table and grabs the nearest waitress and starts dancing, you know, he's a very funny fellow. Last year, they said they were planned to develop a 110,000-member U.S. strike force. That's about probably the extent of the effective military, conventional military forces the United States has at this time, which was going to be targeted into the Middle East, the Persian Gulf area. And during last spring, they proposed to European governments, the West German government, the French government, proposed that this policy be supported. And every government in Europe, except the British, said, "You're insane." And of course, the British said, typically, "How cute." The American people wouldn't go for it, particularly over European opposition. But Mr. Vance and the Carter administration were determined to put a U.S. military force in the Middle East. And people wouldn't go for it. So they said, let's have a mini Pearl Harbor. We'll psych out the American people, and then they'll scream for us to put military forces in the Middle East. And that's the immediate reason that Secretary of State Cyrus Vance orchestrated the seizure of the U.S. Embassy and the taking of hostages with full foreknowledge that bringing the Shah into the United States would probably cause that action at that time. And just for insurance, Ramsey Clark advised him to do something like that. The former Attorney General of the United States, a member of the Kennedy machine, who, like Kennedy, has great affection for what he calls the Iranian Revolution. Now, why do they want to put a military force in the Middle East? Well, to shut off the world's oil supply. What else? To overthrow the government of Saudi Arabia, which the government of Saudi Arabia has complained to the United States government that the United States government, led by the Kennedy forces in the Congress and Justice Department, with fake scandal mongering, are trying to do to Saudi Arabia what they did over the past year and a half to Iran. And the Saudis said, please don't do this. You're making us angry. So the next day, after Miller is kicked out of Saudi Arabia, not asked to leave, kicked out, and told, cut this out, Kennedy ups the ante, and the scandals pour out of the New York Times and so forth. They want to destroy Saudi Arabia, to cut off the world's oil supply from Saudi Arabia, just as they are doing from Iran, to engulf the entire region on which the bulk of the world marketing supplies of petroleum now depend, to cut off the oil. Which means, of course, great joy in the United States, an oil hoax like you haven't seen before. And U.S. military forces in the Middle East are just exactly the trigger and cover to make that happen. So the day those forces go in, don't cheer, the boys are landing. Say, boy, that's the last time you saw oil for a long time to come, because that's what's at stake. Now, Vance did this because the Carter administration, or the people that own it, intend to have most of the world's oil supply cut off. They intend it. When was this policy decided? It was decided this past spring at the mansion, Arden House, of former New York State Governor Averell Harriman. All of the big oil companies were there. British Petroleum, Royal Dutch Shell, Mobil, Exxon, and so forth. Now, the big oil companies are actually part of a cartel. And the cartel is based in London. It has an official castle in Scotland, but it's based in London. And it's run from the top down by British Petroleum, Royal Dutch Shell, and by the related financial interests of the City of London. They're the ones that want to cut off most of the world's oil supply. The policy was argued at Arden House. Herman Schmidt of Mobil Corporation took the same position that British Petroleum and Royal Dutch Shell did, and Exxon capitulated. And since that time, the oil companies have been dedicated not only to ripping off the United States, but to cutting off a good deal of the world's oil supply, knowing that the consequences of this are death through famine, epidemic, and social chaos for a great deal of the world's population. The oil companies cold-bloodedly made a decision which makes Adolf Hitler look relatively like a humanitarian. And our government, the Carter administration, is complicit in that. Consciously, willingly complicit. The people who own CBS, the people who own ABC, the people who own NBC, the people who own the New York Times, the people who own the Detroit Free Press. These people are wittingly complicit in this treason against the United States and this willful genocide against most of the world's population. And that is the reason that Cyrus Vance articulated the taking of hostages against the United States in Tehran. Then they went to Western Europe. And they said to Western Europe, you have to support us. The Western Europeans said, you're crazy. And they said, that's irrelevant. You have to support us, because if you don't, we'll put our military forces in the Middle East and we'll destabilize your oil supplies in your nations, and your populations will collapse. So the Europeans said, yes, naturally we have great sympathy with the Carter administration's current aims. Is it necessary for us to repeat that? Now, for some period of time, particularly since the Carter administration was inaugurated, the only thing that's prevented the world from going to war, and I mean thermonuclear war in all probability, has been a developing coalition led by the President of France, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and a somewhat progressively developing figure, Helmut Schmidt, the Chancellor of West Germany. The Paris-Bonn alliance has been the only thing holding up the value of the U.S. dollar while the Carter administration was trying to drive it down and preventing the world from going to war. The creation of the European monetary system is the only thing that's held the dollar above collapse. Carter has managed to accomplish a 25% devaluation of the dollar. He could have done much more, but for the opposition to the collapse of the dollar from the Europeans. Similarly, the Europeans have been the only force which have been preventing the implementation of full-scale genocide in the developing sector. The policies of the Carter administration are for genocide. Let's not make any bones about this. Let's not be polite. Let's call a murderer a murderer. The Carter administration is the most immoral thing, second to Peking, which the 20th century has seen in the form of an administration of any country. It is an administration. Carter doesn't know any better. He's too dumb to understand. But the people who run him is puppet masters. The Carter administration is wittingly dedicated to a policy which the designers of the policy predict will reduce the world's population from its present level of about 4 billion to a level of between 1 and 2 billion by the end of this century, in 2 decades. That is the policy to which the masters of the Carter administration are dedicated, and that's one of the reasons that Cyrus Vance organized the taking of U.S. hostages in Iran. They are dedicated to this. They are pure evil in the sense, the biblical sense, of satanic. There's no morality which justifies anybody supporting the candidacy of Kennedy or Carter or Connolly or Brown or Bush or Reagan. They're all supporting the same policy. Whether it's dummies supporting the policy because of the people that run them, or because they're conscious of what they're doing, like John Connolly. There's no morality in a citizen who support such people. There's no morality, in fact, in the citizen who supports national unity behind treason and genocide, the policies of Cyrus Vance and of the Carter administration. That's the reality we face. Now, with the capitulation of Paris and Bonn to national unity with the treasonous and genocidal character of the Carter administration, the Soviets have gone crazy. The forces in the Soviet Union, which were cooperating with Schmidt and Giscard, which were oriented to cooperation with the European monetary system, which were oriented to supporting a policy of economic development as opposed to genocide in the Third World, those forces have just been set back in what amounts to a virtual coup d'etat, in which the friends and patrons of a British intelligence operative, KGB General H. Kim Philby, are on top. So we have, at this point, in Moscow, the dominant force is associated with a formerly deposed president of the Soviet Union, Podgorny, who is for a confrontationist policy against the United States in the Third World. And you have, in the United States, a Carter administration, when it's not committing treason and genocide, is seeking a confrontation with the Soviet Union of the Third World. We are on a collision course in which the general policy of the world is now toward genocide, worse than Hitler's, and as an added feature, you have the two principal powers of the world, the Soviet Union and the United States, on a collision course which leads directly toward thermonuclear war by strategic miscalculation. That's the situation in the world. And that's why Vance orchestrated the taking of U.S. hostages by the Khomeiniac regime in Iran. Now, what's going to tilt this? Visibly, there's only one way, which is clearly visible, by which the world at this time could be swerved off the present course, the present plunge into a genocidal new dark age of humanity. There's only one visible way. And everything is long odds. Anything else. Other things could work, but if you count on them, you're just gambling on the wildest kind of odds. And that is to tilt the internal political processes, the institutionalized political processes inside the United States. Without that, anyone who says the world has a chance or will get by or the next years will work out, that person is just plain ignorant or a fool. There's no other alternative. And the only way you can tilt the process in the United States is to tilt it in terms of the election campaigns. It's the only process. Therefore, as long as the world believes that Bush, Reagan, Connolly, Carter, and Kennedy are the choices for the presidency in 1980, the world will probably not survive, at least civilization as we've known it. Therefore, unless we have a candidacy which is perceived to have institutionalized momentum and potential, which represents an opposite policy You cannot straighten the world out. You cannot prevent the continued plunge toward a new dark age, toward barbarism. Nothing will stop it. Unless you get in the United States the kind of muscle that says send Vance up the steps of the gibbet and hang the creature for treason. Unless you get that kind of force in motion, we are going perhaps to World War III, but certainly into a new dark age, just as surely as the world went into two preceding world wars. The same general logic, the same contemptible immorality and pragmatism of the politicians, the same capitulation of masses of people, whether to Woodrow Wilson in this country or to other fools in other countries. The masses of people marched like sheep, confident in their leaders, cheering their leaders into World War I. The masses of people in their wisdom and democracy and opinion and judgment marched like sheep into World War II. And the masses of people behind their accepted leaders, in their considered judgment, in their democratic opinion, are right now marching into the hell of a new dark age, led by satanic forces. The only word to describe it. And unless you create at a crucial point in the world process some new institutionalized element which will rally forces, change the dynamic, change the direction of the situation, to give humanity an option, reconcile yourself, not to a depression, but if we are lucky enough to avoid thermonuclear war, reconcile yourself to watching people die around the world, maybe half the world's population, maybe more, over the next 20 years, in a new dark age like that, spanning the middle of the 13th to the middle of the 14th century. That's what we're headed for. And unless the only thing which can change this at this time has to come from within the United States, has to become the institutionalization of a new force, challenging, contending credibly such swine as Bush, Reagan, Connally, Carter, and Kennedy for the presidential nomination and election. Without that, I will not guarantee a new dark age, but I cannot guarantee anything else, and it's coming fast. Now, how do we deal with this situation? I'm obviously talking about my candidates. It is clear. And 55 to 75% of the American people, if they get out of their sheepishness, if we can get them out of their sheep-like behavior, really agree with me vis-a-vis this bunch of treasonous, genocidal swine like Cyrus Vance or George Bush or Connally or Reagan, who are all the same thing. There's not a penny's worth of difference between them, even in this age of inflation. Well, as I wrote to our friend, the head of state of a worthwhile country, the way to look at the world today in terms of strategic options is with the example of the case of Alexander the Great in mind. It's obvious Schmidt can't do much more than he's doing. He's a limited man. We appreciate what he represents, but he's not a world leader. He's just a competent statesman, better than what we fear we might get otherwise. Giscard's a little higher quality in terms of culture, intellectual development than Schmidt. But he's no world leader. He's just the best we've got. Indira Gandhi, I hope, will be elected very soon in India. She's a very good and indispensable person, but I know her limitations. We'll go through with the best people in various parts of the world. I know their limitations. They're not going to lead the world out of this mess. They have already failed. They had the opportunities. We told them in many cases what the opportunities were. They lacked the courage and perception to act. and it's their failure when they could have won this fight and stopped this hell. This brought us to this mess. Sure, we had Cyrus Vance arranging the taking of U.S. hostages in Iran, but that could have been stopped, prevented. And don't tell me about Schmidt. I have my grudging respect for his usefulness. Don't tell me about Giscard. I have my grudging respect for the limitations of his courage. Don't tell me about the rest of the leaders of the world. I have measured them, and they have all failed. So don't talk to me about nations. Don't talk to me about the Soviet Union is not going to go along with genocide. They will. Nothing will prevent it. Don't talk to me about mass movements, relevant political forces. Don't give me any of the pragmatic things. They don't work. They've all failed. In fact, they have greased the skids that have led us into this situation. So let us look back to the 4th century BC. Let us look back to the case of Alexander the Great, because that's the key to what I must try to do now. That is the key to the only thing that's going to prevent this sick human race, this civilization which has declared itself morally unfit to survive. It's the only means by which this civilization will survive. It's the only means by which having children is going to mean a thing. What happened in the 4th century BC? Well, the world was in a horrible mess. You had the ugliest of obscenities up to that time. The Persian Empire, dominating the world. The allies of the Babylonian cults, which ran the Persian Empire, were running Egypt, the cult of Isis, the cult of Thebes. Greece was in a hideous state. The city-states of Ionia had been crushed. The majority of the forces in Athens were corrupt and rotten. The evil cult of Apollo, of Delphi, ran much of Greece and was already running Rome at that time, which was a little obscure hick town at that point in the Mediterranean. The preponderance of forces in the world was evil, as today. And it was a great scheme afoot, very much like the one world scheme of Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells and Aldous Huxley and Robert M. Hutchins and all these other UNO-type kooks. These one world, UNO, it's our enemy. First thing you ought to do is shoot that down if you want to defend the United States. Then you can take care of the lesser enemies afterward. They were going to divide the world. They had a new scheme. This old one Persian Empire thing wasn't working out too well. You had to make 2 Persian empires. So they had this grand scheme for doing this. And Philip of Macedon, aided by the agent, this cult agent, Aristotle, as well as others, had the scheme for conquering Greece, putting it under Macedonia, and then using that conquest, using the Greek forces, which are the only qualified fighting troops in the world at that time, and using that thing to carve up the world between an Eastern Persian Empire and a Western Persian Empire, or a Western Empire based on what was called the oligarchical Persian model. The same philosophy. The Great Britain, or the United Nations organization, or the people behind the Carter administration, or the kooks down in the crypt of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York. The same kind of kookery. Cults, oligarchical models. We mustn't have too much technology. Science is a threat. Back to the simple life. Small is beautiful. Let's have a bigger empire. The same kind of kookery. It was in this setting that the work of Plato and the conspiratorial organization known as the Academy at Athens developed. And at the point that Philip of Macedon, or Philip the Unspeakable, as we speak of him privately, was about, with his homosexual generals, to take them out of the ways of pederasty for a moment, and to lead the forces already based in Asia Minor down to accomplish this great project, the creation of two Persian empires that is a one-world arrangement of two empires, two regionalizations. At that point, Philip was assassinated. And in the ensuing affray, Alexander the Great, a protege of the Academy of Athens, advised by them, took over, consolidated his position, and led these pederastic generals who never improved their morality. They were never positive forces for humanity, and led them to destroy the Persian Empire. And during the brief period of his remaining life, to set into motion the greatest city-building project, the greatest project of human development mankind has ever seen, in terms of the population and the rate of development involved. Building cities everywhere. There were Alexander cities all over the world, and more planned. Great trade development, great cultural development. Then Aristotelizations poisoned Alexander. And the pederastic sodomy-performing generals took over again and destroyed most of the world. And that great, hideous obscenity called the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire took over and plunged humanity in the course of existence into a dark age, a genocidal dark age of famine, relieved by cannibalism, epidemic, and homicidal social chaos. And out of this process, the Neoplatonics managed to save civilization, which, such as it is, we have today. We're about to lose. Now, we must look at the world today, not in terms of which good countries as objective entities have the right presidents and ruling parties, and do they represent the majority, and can they run the world, and are we safe? It ain't going to work that way. It cannot. The people are ignorant, including the people of the United States. They may be educated, literate, but they're morally and intellectually ignorant and miseducated. This people of the United States is, in terms of its present orientation, its behavior like sheep, is morally unfit to survive. It may have the potentials to become morally fit to survive, but in terms of its behavior, its political behavior, what it tolerates from the press, what it tolerates from the media, what it tolerates in making homosexuality a political cause, and that it tolerates drugs. This people, in terms of its practice, has reached the point that in terms of that practice is morally unfit to survive. So don't tell me what candidate the people like. Their opinion has no weight with me. The question is, do the people have the ability to overcome such stupidity and to manifest those better qualities which lie within them, waiting to be evoked, and can I help evoke them? Don't tell me about France. Don't tell me about Mexico. Don't tell me about movements in Africa or Asia or any place else. I know them all. And I've measured them and found them wanting. Today, what is required is an implementation of the same principle exemplified by the Alexander project of the Academy of Athens. What is necessary is not to assemble a majority of people for the right cause. That would be desirable, but you're not going to make that majority that easily. The majority of people are either evil or they are simply corrupted like sheep, and they will not respond on that basis. The only way you're going to move the world is to move it. Just as Alexander moved armies which were full of sodomy and kept them too busy to become pederastic at the moment. Engaged them in battles which they would not have conceived and which they did not want to fight, but the very force of motion compelled them to do that. And so by keeping the forces in the correct motion, even though the force's nature would prevent them from doing good, evil was compelled to do good because it was so moved to do against its will. And that's the way we're going to move this world, on momentum. Momentum around a leadership which is self-consciously understands how to do that. That's why I must become President of the United States. Now, I do not propose to make the United States an empire. I am not an ambitious person. I am merely hubristic. And there is a distinction. I propose that by taking the presidency over the next 9 years or 8 years in office, that in the presidency I shall lead the world. I shall take nations and heads of state, unwilling instruments, and I shall compel them to do good by forcing them to move in the direction where I know how to use the power of the United States to force them to move. We are going, for example, I'm going to do what Roosevelt promised to do in 1940-42. What Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of all people, promised to do, I'm going to do it. He said, and prohibition. No, put the drug interest in jail, among other things. Now, Roosevelt promised to Churchill at the Atlantic meeting and the Casablanca meeting, he said, no more will the United States fight world wars to save the British Empire in any shape or guise. No more will the United States tolerate the British system, whether colonial or neo-colonial. No more will the United States tolerate the economics of Adam Smith in any part of the world. We are going to take this aching, poor, hungry world, and we're going to transform it with American methods. We're going to transform it by export and development of high technology. We're going to have Manhattan projects and NASA projects and every dirigist, federally directed, scientific Christ program that we deem necessary. You know, some people talk about how many nuclear plants can you build. I understand American methods. If I want to build 10,000 nuclear plants by the year 2000, we'll do it. It can be done. If we putter along the way we'd like to do it, it won't happen. You want to have 50 or 100 nuclear starts a year, we can do it. Just take the table of requirements. We need how many steel plants, how many of this, build them all, right now. If we have to melt down the neon signs on the whorehouses to do it. If we have to take everybody we find walking in a disco and say, hey fella, you just got diagnosed as needing clinical therapy here, work therapy. Take them out, you want to do all that jiggling, we got a place to use some of that energy, right? Oh. We're going to use American methods, which means to mobilize the world along the lines of the American system. And every nation that wants to go along with us on that, and most of them will, just like some of Alexander's generals wanted to survive and therefore went along with him, we will do that. We will not ask the opinion of third world countries. We don't have to. Because a government of a third world country that doesn't want that is no good. Therefore, we ignore it. The government that does is a good government. Therefore, we honor its opinion. Because a government will not develop high-technology agriculture, develop industry and high-technology infrastructure and education for its people. A government that sits back and says, we don't want any of that imperialist culture or European culture. That's depressing. We say, okay, you're stupid, fellow. Get out of the way. We're going to do it anyway. It's not going to be democratic. Not in that term. Because our problem is the world is morally unfit, the present state of civilization, to survive. And we have to break civilization out of its present state to a higher state. We must move people by having people who can lead in crucial positions of leadership, and move the unworthy and unfit that have to be moved to do good work the way Alexander moved his generals. Now that brings me to the point about the International Caucus of Labor Committees. Although we did not set out to do so consciously back in 1966, for very lawful reasons, this organization became a replication of the Academy of Athens in terms of scope of work, direction of work, understanding of its role in the world. This developed over a period of years, largely because of the central determining character of the organization from the inception. The fact that the organization was based on a conception of political economy and method, in which the conception of multiply connected manifolds associated with Riemann was at the center of the political economic perception from which we worked. And that perception, as a matter of method as well as economic conception, was the characteristic and the determining characteristic which shaped the way our judgment developed. And as we came into conflict with opposing forces on this, as we sorted various forces in the world out and found out what was real, what dripping behind the stage props, to see what the reality is behind the appearances, then we found ourselves becoming that. And so we have therefore found our activities variegated, and as this conference will emphasize, one of the things we're emphasizing, and certainly not because of the Year of the Child, anything the UN comes up with, we're again. Particularly UNESCO, UNITAR, or UNCTAD. No, but because we are at a point, we've got two problems in the world. First of all, drugs and a miserly and dastardly and treasonous destruction of the process of education is turning out increasingly from our secondary schools students who aren't qualified mentally to graduate from the third grade. The minds, the productivity, the potential of our society is being ruined. And we say, and all of us agree more or less on that, in the population, those of us who are healthy and sane, we say, well, let's at least get back to what we had in the 50s. Something that works, even though it may have imperfections. But that's not adequate. We have to make reforms, not in the direction of socially relevant basket weaving and sensitivity courses and things like that, or mainstream education, as I call it now. We used to call it sewage, now it's called mainstream. We need to reevaluate our educational processes as they were. We need to come up with new approaches which facilitate the development of the potential genius of every child. We are tired of producing mediocrities. We're now producing imbeciles, but we used to produce mediocrities back in the 50s and before that. You know, we had one or two bright kids, someone who talked a lot but didn't know anything, and a lot of mediocrities. Now today, you've got mostly imbeciles coming out of our schools in terms of functional capabilities. The reality is that most children have the potentiality to be a genius if that potentiality is developed and seized upon early enough and given the correct direction. It's our job to do so. Our approach to music is precisely that. We took seriously the question of focusing on music because we recognized that Plato was right, that Al-Farabi was right. Is the first thing that a child is capable of mastering in the sense of organized education is the well-tempered system of counterpoint, polyphonic counterpoint. The first thing the child's mind can master in terms of a comprehensive knowledge of lawfulness on the one hand and freedom, i.e. creativity within the context of lawfulness on the other. The child now understands something Kant never understood. That to be creative is not to violate the laws of the universe, but to develop new qualities of solutions in terms of the basic lawful ordering of the universe. And once the child's mind grasps that freedom and creativity and law are not antagonistic, except if you misunderstand law, Once the child has understood that, then the foundation is laid, the foundation of reference for the child to understand anything. We know in the next order of learning that after the child's mind has been given a foundation by learning the music of Bach and Beethoven, or at least that method, which is indispensable if you're going to produce geniuses. And no other kind of music will produce geniuses, so just don't waste your time with it. No matter how much you think you like it or somebody else likes it, it won't produce geniuses. We're concerned with producing geniuses. The next thing is geometry. Not the way it was taught in school, but geometry taught without quod erat demonstrandum, without logic, without Aristotelianism. Because Aristotelianism destroys the mind. We want no Aristotle or no influence of Aristotle in our school system. And once they've learned geometry, we're going to teach them physics. What, at the age of 8, 9, and 10? I do not want a single child of this nation to reach the age of 16 in the future without being a qualified genius in physics. We need that. And it can be done. We look back at the last dark age, or the aftermath of the last dark age. In the 14th century, when out of the bowels of the Black Death, the bowels of the same policies that Cyrus Vance represents today, or Henry Kissinger, or the rest of those scoundrels, after half the population of Europe had been wiped out within a century by these policies, which the Carter administration and the Connolly and Reagan all espouse today, a group of people like us, that is, that's our heritage, organized the Golden Renaissance. One of the key things was the development of teaching institutions like Gerhard Grote's Brothers of the Common Life, which produced a generation of geniuses into the 16th century. We today face the same thing. On the one hand, we face a dark age. And it seems, if anyone thinks clearly, that the forces of the Dark Age are now victorious and will prevail, and therefore hell will come. Now, we can avoid that. We must avoid it. We will avoid it, not simply by resisting the Dark Age, by going out in the street and screaming against the Dark Age. Please keep the Dark Age away, Mr. Banker. That isn't going to work. We will defeat the Dark Age by building a new Golden Renaissance. It is the function of this institution to be the catalytic agency which produces people who are capable of leadership and supplies to those who have the function of leadership throughout the world additional vital resources of knowledge and policy through which the world can be steered into and through a new Golden Renaissance. Thank you.